Is it reasonable to believe in God? Can God's existence be logically proven without appealing to personal religious experience or a leap of faith? Our secular culture may dismiss God as irrelevant to our existence and give the seductive impression that God is on a long-term vacation. This popular concept may provide some with a sense of freedom and autonomy, but that has not delivered us from boredom, anxiety, stress, drugs, crime, addiction to entertainment, along with other neuroses. After diagnosing the human predicament, psychiatrist Viktor Frankl observes, "More people today have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. People today suffer from an inner deadness. They live in the midst of plenty, but are joyless." Now that sounds rather nihilistic, but that is not the topic for this video. At the end of his famous work, Critique of Practical Reason, Immanuel Kant proposed a new argument for God's existence called the moral argument. Kant declares, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Long before Kant, Plato argued that the concept of goodness makes sense only in relation to the greater or the ultimate good. If a moral God exists, it would be natural to expect his created beings to experience moral convictions. No human existence is possible without subscribing to moral values. Every day we observe politicians, doctors, lawyers, psychologists, judges, sociologists, police, and ordinary citizens argue for injustice and fairness, equality, tolerance, honesty, responsibility, duty, accountability, civil rights, human rights, and so on. You get the point. We believe it is right to treat all people with equality, and we condemn violence, child abuse, war, corruption, murder, treason, and other such behavior as evil and wrong. The reality of our moral commitment and conscience is unavoidable. We live in a moral universe. Everyone appeals to a moral law by which he or she makes moral judgments. Our moral standards provide a basis for our thinking and behavior. But what about the relativist who insists that there are no absolutes and argues everything is relative? Those who reject absolute moral law and advocate relativism engage in promoting a belief which is logically self-contradictory, subjective, and arbitrary. The rejection of absolutes is the death of morals. In this state, an individual becomes morally paralyzed and unable to make a distinction between right and wrong. Something important to note though is that the suggestion that there are no absolutes is in fact an absolute idea. It is self-contradictory for someone to say, "I am absolutely sure that there are no absolutes." This statement does not remove absolutes, but seductively substitutes itself as the guiding principle. For example, consider these following statements. There are no rules. Trust no authority. Everything is relative. All beliefs are false. Each affirmation becomes an absolute in itself, which is what the person wishes to deny. Hence the argument is not only self-refuting, but is also arbitrary and meaningless. Just like the old Greek philosopher who said every statement is a lie, or the Zen Buddhist aphorism, all statements are absurd. To reject moral absolutes is in essence to affirm that there are no essential moral differences between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. Relativism may appear impressive on the surface, but is philosophically false. It is logically contradictory, morally inadequate, and existentially unlivable. Consider the true story of a philosophy student who wrote an ethics paper arguing that there are no absolutes and everything is relative. Judged by the research, documentation, and scholarship, the paper deserved an A. The professor, however, gave it an F, with a note explaining, "I do not like blue covers." When the student received his paper, he was so upset that he stormed into the professor's office, protesting, "This is not fair. This is not just. I should not be graded on the color of the cover, but on the content of my paper." The professor looked the student in the eye and asked, "Was this the paper which argued that there are no objective moral principles such as fairness and justice, and that everything is relative to one's taste?" Yes, that's the one," replied the student. "Well then," said the professor, "I do not like blue covers. The grade will remain an F." Suddenly, the young student understood that moral absolutes were unavoidable, and that in fact, he also believed in moral principles such as fairness and justice. Furthermore, he was expecting them to be applied in his case. C.S. Lewis writes, "If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality." He also says, "The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard better than the other." The reality of universal law is very much part of the fabric of human society. We are not merely mechanical beings. Our moral convictions are essential to our existence. Without them, we would hardly qualify to be human, as Henry M. Morris explains. Every individual, however benighted, recognizes something in him that tells him that he ought to do the thing that is right morally and ought to shun the wrong, even though individual standards as to what constitutes right and wrong seem to vary somewhat with time and place. Are our moral values merely sociological conventions similar to driving on the left rather than the right side of the road? Or like the subjective utterances that we produce when we order our meals in a restaurant? If morality is merely a social convention, then it is neither objective nor absolute. In this case, the logical question would be, why follow the subjective opinions of society? Why should anyone sacrifice for others' well-being? What if society approved of cannibalism, ritual human sacrifice, or racism? After all, German society in the 30s and 40s gave rise to the Holocaust. Moral philosophers have correctly argued that the prescriptive ought can never be derived from a descriptive is. The brilliant philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein pointed out that the basis of morality and ethics comes from outside the human situation. He says ethics, if anything, is supernatural. In essence, morality is transcendental. If our universe affirms the reality of a moral law and we are creatures with moral capacities, then it is logical to assume that God must exist as a moral being capable of ensuring justice. Hastings Raschel's insight into the problem is remarkable. A moral idea can exist nowhere and no-how but in a mind. An absolute moral ideal can only exist in a mind from which all reality is derived. Our moral ideal can only claim objective validity insofar as it can rationally be regarded as the revelation of a moral ideal eternally existing in the mind of God. If the moral law is not from God, then one must conclude that it evolved from non-moral matter, but the concept of an evolving morality is just tautology. Morality cannot simply evolve or change. People's idea of morality may change, but morality itself is unchangeable, like the laws of logic and mathematics. It is a law of reality. Some things are always either right or wrong, good or evil. It is never right to kill an innocent person, and it is always wrong to abuse a child, whether today or 20 years from now. It would be unreasonable to argue as the lady who wrote to C.S. Lewis declaring, "I don't worry if there is a shortage of bread in our town, because in our home we only eat toast." It is equally irrational to think that we could have no objective moral law without an objective moral lawgiver. If there is no God, there is no logical ground for our morality. The humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz argues correctly when he states, "The central question about moral and ethical principles concerns this ontological foundation. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendent ground, are they purely ephemeral?" Kurtz concedes that if ethics are not theistic, they are transient, ephemeral, and temporal. The rejection of God logically implies the elimination of absolute morality. Richard Taylor observes, "The modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to maintain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that, in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well." The point of the argument is that our moral existence points to a transcendent God who is the source and ground for our morality. If this is not the case, then the alternative is devastating, as D.M. Bailey rightly suggests. Either our moral values tell us something about the nature and purpose of reality, or they are subjective and therefore meaningless. If our morality is not grounded in God, then it is hopelessly subjective. But to reject moral values as meaningless is logically impossible and existentially inadequate. Those who argue that morality is simply descriptive rather than prescriptive miss the point. If morality is nothing more than what humans have invented, then our moral behavior is simply arbitrary and has no ultimate meaning, significance, or value. Jeff Jacoby gave a brilliant summary of the argument. Can people be decent and moral without believing in a God who commands us to be good? Sure, there have always been kind and ethical non-believers, but how many of them reason their way to kindness and ethics, and how many simply reflect the moral expectation of the society in which they were raised? In our culture, even the most passionate atheist cannot help having been influenced by the Judeo-Christian worldview that shaped Western civilization. For in a world without God, there is no obvious difference between good and evil. There is no way to prove that murder is wrong if there is no creator who declares, "Thou shalt not murder." It certainly cannot be proved wrong by reason alone. One might reason instead, as Lenin, Stalin, and Mao reasoned, that there is nothing wrong with murdering human beings by the millions if doing so advances the Marxist cause. It may seem obvious to us today that human life is precious and that the weakest among us deserve special protection. Why would we think so absent a moral tradition stretching back to Sinai? It seems so obvious in classical antiquity that sickly babies should be killed. An excellent case in point is the French atheistic existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who rejected morality as meaningless but could not live on the basis of that rejection. If God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimize our conduct. So in the bright realm of values, we have no excuse behind us, nor justification before us. We are alone with no excuses. After denying the objectivity of morality, Sartre went against his view by signing the Algerian Manifesto that declared that the Algerian War was wrong. If there is objective moral law, then there must be a moral lawgiver. And if we doubt this, we should remember the day of the 20th of April 1999 when 2 students embarked on a massacre at their Columbine High School in Colorado, killing 12 students and a teacher, as well as wounding 23 others before turning their weapons on themselves. Similar events have happened in history, but we need to ask, what drove them to these atrocities? For one thing, they all ardently believe that we are just rearranged pond scum who evolved by random mutation and natural selection, even choosing what would have been Hitler's 110th birthday for the massacre. Another example of denying God is that 2 evolutionists wrote a book claiming that rape had evolved as a device for men to perpetuate their genes. One of the authors tied himself in knots trying to explain why it was still wrong under his philosophy. Our moral reality provides a crucial clue as to the meaning of the universe. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Christians in Rome, confirms the reality of moral evidence. Since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their conscience is also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. Romans 2:15. The moral argument for God's existence from a Christian perspective emphasizes the inseparable link between morality and the divine. Kant and philosophers like C.S. Lewis advocates for a moral lawgiver, challenging relativistic claims and highlighting the self-refuting nature of rejecting moral absolutes. The fabric of human society, woven with moral convictions and universal laws, challenges the idea that morality is merely a societal convention. The rejection of God leads to a precarious foundation for morality, rendering it transient, ephemeral, and ultimately meaningless. The moral argument asserts that our moral experience points toward a God who designed the universe and instilled it within a moral order. Romans 2:15 affirms the presence of the law written on the human hearts, reinforcing the idea that our moral reality provides a crucial clue to the meaning of the universe. Historical events such as the Columbine High School massacre underscore the consequences of denying a moral lawgiver. Proverbs 14:12 warns, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death." The biblical affirmation further reinforces the notion that our moral compass finds its true north in the divine. In essence, the moral argument invites us to contemplate the coherence of our moral convictions, pointing towards the conclusion that a moral lawgiver, God, provides the most rational and meaningful foundation for the fabric of morality woven into the very essence of our existence. As we ponder the watch and its watchmaker, the universe and its God, the moral argument beckons us to consider that our moral compass may indeed find its true north in the divine.